From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons.
Primary elections taking place in 3 states today, including New York, where Congressman Jamal Bowman could become the first member of the squad to lose a re-election effort. We'll explore this contest and others with Larry Sabato of Sabato's Crystal Ball.
And we'll talk with Democratic Congresswoman Gwen Moore from the swing state of Wisconsin about messaging ahead of this week's presidential debate and the Republican convention in Milwaukee.
The judge in Donald Trump's hush money trial in New York relaxes the former president's gag order. We'll have more ahead with our political panel. Interesting day in politics, Kaylee, as we watch not only Donald Trump's hush money trial unfold, but the preparations that both Donald Trump and Joe Biden are going through ahead of the big debate on Thursday. That'll be the big moment of the week, unless, of course, the Supreme Court surprises us.
Well, that's very true. We are set to get orders from the court tomorrow through Friday, potentially even into next week. And we know a few of those orders could relate directly to the legal trials of Donald Trump. But at the same time, we still have plenty of news to follow on this Tuesday, including the fact that it's a primary day. And while we no longer really care about primaries at the presidential level because we have our presumptive nominees, there are some interesting ones looking down the ballot.
Happy primary day. Here we are yet again. Key congressional primaries happening right now in 3 states, as we mentioned. Voters in New York, Colorado, and Utah heading to the polls as Democrat Jamal Bowman fights to hang on to his seat in New York and Republican Lauren Boebert tries to win a new one in Colorado. Joining us now to distill all of this with races to watch, Bloomberg's Wendy Benjaminson. Wendy, it's great to see you. We should pick through these one at a time. I'll start in New York with Jamal Bowman, down 17 points, according to the most recent survey we saw from Emerson College polling. AIPAC has put an enormous amount of money, in fact, a spending record for a U.S. congressional race. Is that why he's set to lose?
That's one of the reasons he's set to lose. But I think one of the reasons that AIPAC put so much money into it is that his views on the Middle East or Israel's war with Gaza may be in line with other people on his side of the political spectrum, with the squad, with the progressive left, with young voters and voters of color. And they have these legitimate concerns about Israel's conduct of the war. However, he represents a sliver of the Bronx and Westchester County, one of the most Jewish districts in the nation. And so I think he might have forgotten about his constituents and gone for the bigger politics, which is something that happens all over the country, of course. But that may have led to the fact that George Latimer, the Westchester County executive, a 70-year-old white man, is likely to win this primary.
Well, which will be remarkable in that this will be the first time that an incumbent has gone down in a primary, knowing we still don't actually know the results of the Virginia 5th District race from where Bob Good was up against a challenger in John McGuire. That race remains too close to call. So technically, Jamal Bowman could be the first incumbent to fall.
Absolutely. And I think what we're seeing here is the emergence of a theme, maybe, of where centrist Democrats may be getting ahead of the more progressive left. And at the same time, if we see people like Lauren Boebert in Colorado lose, or Governor Spencer Cox in Utah, or some of these people best the more MAGA-like candidates, then we're seeing a theme emerge of maybe that the extremes in this country might want to, voters don't want to see those extremes in the country anymore. I think there's also a possibility that voters who really do think about this may want to put a stopgap on the presidential candidate, whereas if you're going to vote for Trump because you're so dissatisfied with Biden or because you like Donald Trump, you may vote for a Democrat for Congress or a more centrist member of the Republican Party in order to put some sort of guardrails on the presidency a little bit.
So what about Bob? You mentioned Bob Good. Let's talk about this. A week later, he's on the ropes, a week after the Virginia primary. This is the head of the Freedom Caucus in the House. We discussed this. Donald Trump, Kevin McCarthy, both opposing him along with the Main Street Caucus. He was hoping for a recount, Wendy. It was a close match with John McGuire. They have found in the latest week that Bob Good actually lost a couple of votes. He's now losing by 373 votes and says that he will try to block certification in an interview with Steve Bannon, of all people. Maybe that shouldn't be a surprise, but you can't do that around here, can you?
No, you can't. The primaries are run by the party, not the states. I think the states administer them, but the rules are all set by the political parties. And so there is no certification in the sense that where we had on January 6th, where you have Congress, certify that the election results were there and officially take them in. That doesn't really happen at the state level, and there's no process by which he could block certification of it. Either the Republican Party declares him the nominee or they don't. And I think they only found 10 problematic
10
ballots so
ballots.
far, so it's not looking really great for him. And there was a lot of machinery behind ousting him.
Yeah, so Trump, McCarthy,
the establishment,
Main Street Republicans. Had a lot of cards stacked against him,
right.
to be sure.
And he can move to another district in Virginia in 26 and run again, just like Lauren Boebert's doing in Colorado tonight.
Yep, very fair. Moving from the 3rd to the 4th, the seat vacated by former Congressman Ken Buck. Bloomberg's Wendy Benjaminson, thank you so much. Now, also today, a judge in New York changing the terms of former President Donald Trump's gag order, allowing him to criticize jurors and witnesses in the hush money case. This as Trump and Joe Biden prepare to face off in Thursday night's CNN presidential debate in Atlanta. Joining us now for more is Bloomberg's Jordan Fabian, who covers the White House and these campaigns for us. So, Jordan, there are still some limits in terms of what Donald Trump can say. For example, he still can't attack the prosecutors in this case, but this could unleash a whole other line of debate, talk, of narrative from Donald Trump that he wasn't going to be able to do before today.
This is why Donald Trump's team was pressing so hard to get this gag order lifted before the debate. This court case and all the court cases against him are a central part of his message that he is this political prisoner, this persecuted individual. And he wasn't necessarily able to talk so freely about that without running the risk of being in contempt of court. Not to mention, he's got a sentencing coming up on July 11th. Yeah. He doesn't want to, get some extra years in jail tacked on by something he said in a debate. His team has argued all along that the gag order was unconstitutional. They're actually not happy with the extent of how the gag order was lifted, and they're planning to appeal. But this is still a win for Donald Trump heading into the debate.
We talked earlier, Jordan, with Cook Political Report founder Charlie Cook, looking ahead to Thursday night about the impact of presidential debates, certainly in this season. Here's what he said.
Most debates don't move the needle much at all. And the little 8 or 10% of people that are really, really, really undecided, they don't read, watch, listen to news. These people are kind of pretty much out, and they only check in late if they check in at all.
Okay, so we're talking to 8 to 10% who don't watch the news anyway, which means they're going to hear about this or see it on social media when it's all sliced up the next morning. Doesn't that make the imperative for both Joe Biden and Donald Trump to find those viral moments that will be sliced up and served up to people on Friday morning?
Yeah, and for Joe Biden, it's also about avoiding certain viral moments, something that might make him look old and feeble. This is something his campaign is trying to combat. They don't want him to freeze up or have some kind of senior moment up there. Yeah. And so, he's been at Camp David for a week, preparing studiously for this debate. Hopefully, in the eyes of his campaign advisors, putting on a performance like the one he put on during the State of the Union, where he came across as energetic and in command. That's what the message they want to send to their voters, that, they want to reassure Democrats that he is up for the task of another 4 years in office. So I want to quibble a little bit with what Charlie Cook said, because while the 8 to 10% of undecided voters are out there not paying attention to this, a lot of Democrats who want to see Joe Biden put on a strong performance are going to be tuning in. And so he needs to perform for the live audience, and he needs to make sure he's not only creating viral moments, hitting Donald Trump on some of those key issues, but also avoiding some of those freezes that we've seen over the past few weeks.
No pressure. Bloomberg's Jordan Fabian reporting on the White House for us. At Bloomberg, we thank you. Something else you should know today. WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange is poised to walk free after nearly 15 years of trying to avoid imprisonment here in the U.S. Assange expected to plead guilty to leaking U.S. national security data as part of an agreement that would sentence him to time already served in the U.K., allowing him to return to his home country of Australia. Assange's wife said she was optimistic about the plea deal.
this period of our lives, I'm confident now, has come to an end. And I think that by this time next week, Julian will be free.
We'll keep you posted on this one. Coming up, Congresswoman Gwen Moore, the Democrat from Wisconsin, joins us just a few weeks ahead of the 2024 Republican National Convention in her backyard in Milwaukee. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I love Milwaukee. I was the one that picked Milwaukee, I have to tell you. I was the one that picked it. These lying people that they say, oh, he doesn't like Milwaukee. I love Milwaukee. I said, you got to fix the crime. We all know that. You got to make sure the election's honest. But I'm the one that picked Milwaukee.
With Donald Trump over the weekend at a campaign event in Wisconsin following comments that he made a few weeks ago on Capitol Hill in which he disparaged the city of Milwaukee, the site, of course, of this year's Republican National Convention. Recalling he referred to it as a horrible city. Republicans said he was simply talking about the crime rate. With us now is Congresswoman Gwen Moore of Wisconsin, whose district includes Milwaukee. That's her hometown. Congresswoman, it's great to see you. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. You're probably going to tell me that Donald Trump just lost Milwaukee. But what does Joe Biden have to say on Thursday night to win Wisconsin?
Well, all Joe Biden has to do is really talk about what he's accomplished, what he's achieved, what he has done for regular people, working people, and families, as opposed to Donald Trump providing, $2 trillion to the wealthiest individuals and corporations, and just admiring us in more debt. That's all he has to do is demonstrate what he's done. And really, Donald Trump isn't going to be able to do anything except rant and rave.
Well, it's not just about the debate, as we so often hear. It's about the spin after the fact, what clips get replayed, where the campaign goes to relive the moments that they felt were the greatest. We know that Donald Trump is planning to go to a rally in Virginia. Joe Biden's going to go campaign in New York and New Jersey after the debate. Would a visit to Wisconsin better serve him?
I'm not running their campaign. I know that we on the ground have got to do a lot of education. I think that, when people watch the debate, including people in Milwaukee, they will see a sharp contrast between these two candidates. I don't know why the president is choosing to go to New York, a place where he has already secured the vote. But we've seen Joe Biden numerous times in Milwaukee, numerous times. And not only have we seen him, but we've seen the results of his policies. I mean, we had Foxconn, where the Republicans Foxconn not out outfoxed us, but conned us into spending millions, tens of millions of dollars for a company that was supposed to create jobs that never showed up. And Joe Biden was able to secure Microsoft as a company, and it's really going to rev up economic development in Racine County, where I was born, create partnerships with the university to give people training, and it's a very, very exciting development. Joe Biden has come to Milwaukee and visited companies that are going to be building electric charging stations. He's come to Milwaukee with the bipartisan infrastructure bill and demonstrated how he's going to create more walkable, sustainable neighborhoods. So it's all an issue of being about it instead of just talking about it.
Mm-hmm. We should note, Congresswoman, that you serve on the House Ways and Means Committee, which means taxes. And we're stepping into a grand debate right now in Washington about whether to make permanent or somehow extend the 2017 Trump-era tax cuts. A lot of money is already being spent on making this happen. What does Joe Biden need to tell voters who are worried about a tax hike? What would you tell your constituents who are worried about this?
Oh, Joe Biden has not proposed any taxes on anybody who makes under $400,000 a year. Whereas the Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017, created tax cuts, put us $2 trillion deeper in debt. And the benefit went to 80% of the benefit went to the top 5%, went to the large corporations and wealthy individuals. And Moody
They're
Analytics.
set to expire next year.
Exactly. Well, if we extend those tax cuts, Moody Analytics has warned us that it will create greater inflation and possibly put us into a recession. And even Republican leadership is beginning to see this. I mean, Tom Cole, the chair of the Appropriations Committee, Jason Smith, the chair of the Ways and Means Committee, Jody Arrington, the chair of the Budget Committee, they all realize that, number one, these taxes have not contributed to any kind of growth at all. GDP has been flat. It is not, in fact, these tax cuts have in fact not paid for themselves. It has created $2 trillion worth of debt. And that, if we renew them as they propose, it'll create $5 trillion worth of debt. And three, this idea of just starving the beast, just making, cutting our way into reducing the deficit actually will not help either. It will just suspend all kind of growth if we were to do that. And so, Democrats are going to get back into the majority. And once again, as this isn't true, under all Democratic regimes, and hopefully Joe Biden will be our president, that we will see us righting our economy. Every time Republicans are in charge, we have seen these kinds of deficits because of their determination to turn the entire revenue over to rich people.
Well, Republican Senator Ted Cruz of Texas talked to us about this whole lower taxes, higher deficit question last week. He had this to say when I asked him about it.
After the 2017 tax cuts, in 2018 and 2019, we saw total federal tax revenue go up and go up significantly. That's simple math. It was contrary to the projections. Now, you're right, the deficit went up. Why? Because politicians spent like crazy. They spent like drunken sailors, but the tax cut increased federal tax revenues.
I'm sure, Congresswoman, given your previous answer, that you disagree with that. But when Senator Cruz joined us last week, he was also putting forward legislation about not taxing tipped income. Whatever merits you think his argument does or does not have, does that notion have any merit for those service workers who might see their lives greatly changed by that kind of change in tax policy? He's talking about taxing tips? I'm not sorry, taxing tipped income. Not taxing tips. Well, I just think that, that's sort of, legislating around the edges. I mean, not taxing tips, is just a little bit of revenue. The reality is that we need to go where the money is. I just want to comment on his observation that revenues went up. They went up just temporarily as we sort of repatriated some of the money. And so on paper, revenues went up, but not for long, because those revenues were used to buy back stock and other sort of unproductive things. And so ultimately, it did not contribute to any kind of revenue growth. And we still had the $2 trillion debt deficit paid for by debt. All right, we'll leave it on that note. Congresswoman Gwen Moore, the Democrat from Wisconsin, member of the House Ways and Means Committee. Always great to have you on the program. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Now coming up, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez going mainstream? How the New York Congresswoman's support for President Biden is reshaping her image. Bloomberg's Christian Hall will join us with that next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. On this New York primary day, we're taking a closer look at Democratic Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. The member of the so-called squad skyrocketed to national fame with ambitious policy proposals and disregard for party elders. But her support of President Biden this cycle has some progressives thinking she's gone too mainstream. Joining us now is Bloomberg's Christian Hall, who has been following this story, has a new story out on her, in fact, you can find on the Bloomberg terminal and online. So, Christian, how can she be both progressive member of the squad, which these days means being pretty anti-Joe Biden's policy toward Israel, but also Joe Biden advocate trying to win him the youth and minority vote?
Well, it's not easy. I mean, AOC is really trying to straddle the fence between the progressive flank of her party, but also, the establishment Democrats. It's not an easy feat at all. And she's definitely received some flack from her progressive colleagues.
I'm sure you met some of them on Saturday night. She was stumping for Jamal Bowman, who we're told could be the first squad member to lose re-election in this primary happening tonight in New York. So she's kind of straddling the line here. But has she lost credibility with progressives you met, or is she able to do both?
Well, I think that she's trying to do both, but again, it's not easy. One of the voters that I met at the rally, I was speaking to them, and I asked them, what do you think about this evolution of AOC as a politician? Yeah. And one of the things they reminded me of is back in 2018, when she first came into Congress. She was one of the members of Congress that helped stage a sit-in in Nancy Pelosi's office. Huh. And they were like, that was the candidate that we voted for and we backed, and we don't have that anymore. So a lot of progressives are disappointed with this evolution of AOC as a congressperson.
We have just a minute left, Christian, but is that evolution in part because she's eyeing something bigger than just the congresswoman from New York? Does she want to be part of leadership if Democrats retake the House? What's the angle?
Potentially. I also think that she realizes that in order for her ambitious ideas to really get off the ground in Congress, she's going to have to really learn how to navigate the political system, and I think that's what we see her doing.
Bloomberg's Christian Hall. It's one of the most widely read stories on the terminal and online. Christian, great reporting, and thank you for bringing it to us today at the table on Balance of Power. Coming up, we remind you it's primary day, and we're going to take a look at how a race, just talking about it, New York's 16th, Jamal Bowman might come down to the age of voters. Larry Sabato, director of the Center for Politics at the University of Virginia, joins next, only on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
The hard part is always in presidential debates, you have the people who are partisans who tune in. Usually those who are somewhat interested voters or who are marginally aligned with either party, they ignore the debates because there's no one to root for.
That was political scientist Lara Brown speaking yesterday here on Balance of Power about the types of voters that tune into presidential debates. This as Trump and Biden prepare for their first face-off of this election cycle on Thursday. Joining us now for more is Larry Sabato, director of the Center of Politics at the University of Virginia. Larry, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. I want to ask you whether any minds realistically could be changed by the debate on Thursday. But I feel like a second question is, because this debate is so early, doesn't it leave plenty of time for their minds to be changed back?
Oh, absolutely. It is early. It's the earliest ever. I'm one of those senior citizens who has watched every single debate since the original four, JFK and Nixon. And there were debates during past decades that really made a difference. Kennedy would never have been president without particularly the first debate with Nixon. Ford probably lost because of a mistake he made during one of the debates with Jimmy Carter, and so on. There are others that we could cite. So you never want to dismiss the possibility. But this is so early. And people think they know both Trump and Biden so well that they're not going to learn anything new. I think they're wrong, because both these people have changed a lot in the last 4 years, and they've had a lot of new information given to them. So I'm looking for more than people think in this debate.
Well, that's interesting, Larry, because, you know, we're all fanning the flames. I'm guilty of it, raising the bar on the importance of this thing. We've got countdown clocks going, I suspect, on some network somewhere. But what would happen if they both showed up and were boring?
Well, that's a distinct possibility, but it's a small one. Now, they can be boring, although I don't know that Trump has ever really been boring. At least I've never seen him in a public setting boring. But it's possible. But I think you're going to have enough exchange, and they hate each other enough so that the vitriol will keep you awake. That's my guess. And don't overdrink. Leave the alcohol alone. You won't need it.
Good advice.
All right, so not turning this into the drinking game. Obviously, as we look ahead to Thursday, we should note that before we can get there, we still have a lot to get through this week, including this evening primaries in a number of states, including in New York, where there's one race in particular we're watching, Jamal Bowman, the incumbent Democrat, up against George Latimer. A lot of difference over Israel policy specifically. And we spoke yesterday with Spencer Kimball, the executive director at the Emerson College Polling Center, who has Latimer ahead by 17 points going into this race, about how the youth vote makes a difference. Just take a listen.
In this district, that youth vote is not as strong as in other parts of the country, even in other parts of New York City. So this is not going to be, we're not expecting an overwhelming youth turnout. If he's able to get one, we'll see if he can narrow that lead, particularly in the Bronx. But there's also going to be a very strong older vote, and that's what we normally see in these primaries.
I've been asking all day, Larry, whether this race particularly can be a tell on something wider that we could see in November, whether it's division among Democrats over Israel or whether it's how much youth turnout will matter to Democratic incumbents.
Well, both of those factors are important. Of course, we don't know where the Middle East war will be. I think just about every person out there, I hope, would want there to be a ceasefire. But if it's continuing and if it's raging, then it is going to cause problems for Democrats. There are a sizable number of young people who disagree with the administration's position, so far at least, on Israel and Gaza. As far as the young people generally, they turn out at a lower rate. You're going to see that in the general election. I'll be shocked if you don't see it today in the primary. It's not that young people never vote. Sometimes they get excited, but usually it's the lowest turnout of any age cohort, any age category. So, you know, if Jamal Bowman is depending on young people to get renominated, then he may have an early night.
I want to hear about the role that AIPAC is playing in this campaign here, Larry. The numbers are staggering. $15 million in a U.S. House primary. That's an all-time, according to what I'm reading here, an American record here in American politics. When we back off this particular primary contest and look at this campaign cycle as a whole, how will we describe the role that AIPAC played in the outcomes of primaries and general elections when Israel was such a sensitive topic in 2024?
Well, AIPAC is always influential in American elections, and they play, and when they play to win. In this case, absolutely, because they're aiming at the squad. You know, it's not just going to be Jamal Bowman. I think they're going to try and go after some others, if not in this cycle, then in future cycles. And look, they're willing to play to a great extent. They're willing to raise this amount of money and put it on the table. The American system has no limits. I think many of us wish it were not the way it is right now, but the Supreme Court has made that impossible. So since there are no limits, anybody can play at the level they want. And a group like AIPAC goes about it very smartly. Notice they haven't stressed the Middle East at all, at least in the ads I've seen. They're about other things entirely. At least it has been in the Bowman-Latimer race in New York. So they're not stressing the Middle East. They're going after other issues that they think will move more people in this district. And I suspect that will be true in other districts as well.
Larry, you mentioned there the idea of playing to win, and I wonder the extent to which Donald Trump is playing to win in some of these down ballot races, at least with his endorsement. It does seem the nature of those endorsements has changed this cycle, going more for the mainstream kind of candidates, those that are supported by the NRSC or the NRCC. Those that the establishment wants to back seem to be getting more support from Donald Trump this time around. And I wonder if you view that as the man who kind of magnified the Republican Party, potentially also bringing it back to the center.
Well, I doubt he brings it back to the center, at least on his key issues like the border. But is he running this race somewhat differently? Yes. He has adjusted to the Republican leadership, and the Republican leadership has adjusted to him. That certainly wasn't true in 2016. It was true to a certain degree in 2020 because he was the incumbent president, but there still was a lot of friction there. So the fact is that the establishment is backing Trump to the hilt, and in return, they're asking him to endorse some of their key members to get them over the hump, arguing that they can strengthen Trump in the election, and even more important for Trump, if he is elected to a second term, they're going to help him get his legislation passed. And that seems to have convinced Trump to do what he's doing, and he's trying to get a winning record. You know, he's been citing everywhere the fact that he's won, 50 races and only lost 2. I don't know the exact numbers, and I don't know if that's accurate, but he wants that kind of winning record because it projects the image that he prefers people, not just Republicans, to see, that he is a winner.
Larry, we keep hearing that nobody watches the debates anymore, that this old-fashioned TV exercise is actually going to be played out the next day on social media, that everyone's going to reach for a viral moment so they can see it in their doom scroll on Twitter or forward it to their friends on Facebook. If that's the case, why a debate? Why not just a battle of the videos?
Well, one would hope that in 90 minutes, yes, 2 big commercial breaks, but more or less 90 minutes, you'd have the opportunity for some really substantive exchanges. Now, that's the ideal. We'll see whether these 2 individuals in this particular debate can actually meet that ideal. People underestimate debates because they forget it isn't just about one soundbite. Over time, you get a lot of sound bites. You get it in the evening news, you get it in the morning news. You're going to have it all summer long because the next debate isn't until mid-September. That's a long time. So people who didn't watch the original debate are nonetheless going to see at least the highlights of it over and over and over again. And they absorb the information. Even the low information voters can absorb a lot of that information.
Well, I hope you enjoy your watch party, Larry. We look forward to talking with you on the other side. Larry Sabato, we know, pop the corn at the Center for Politics, where he's director, of course, at the University of Virginia. We thank you. Coming up, all eyes on New York again, with primaries unfolding today in the spotlight, the 16th congressional district, where, yes, incumbent Representative Jamal Bowman's tenure hangs in the balance. Could be the first member of the squad to lose. Our political panel is up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Bowman sounds like he's in huge trouble, and I think George Latimer seems well positioned to take him out. But that's sort of the center up against the hard ideological left. A lot of the primaries that we've been seeing in recent weeks and today on the Republican side, it's basically between the far right and the really, really far right. It's not the classic moderates or centrists.
Was Charlie Cook, the founder of the Cook Political Report, talking with us earlier today on Balance of Power on the showdown between George Latimer and Congressman Jamal Bowman, New York 16. Joining us now, our political panel. Lisa Camooso Miller is back with us, former RNC Communications Director and host of the Friday Reporter podcast, joined today by Pat Dennis, president at American Bridge 21st Century. Great to see both of you here. Pat, the narrative, unless the conventional wisdom is wrong, is that Jamal Bowman will lose and lose badly tonight, the first squad member to do so, largely coming down to the issue of Israel. What does this tell us about the broader progressive movement here if the squad is starting to bump into the wall?
Yeah, well, my organization, American Bridge, we're a piece of democratic infrastructure. We don't endorse in these primaries. We don't play in these primaries. But, we will be watching because New York is an incredibly important state for the House overall. So no matter what happens, a Democrat's going to represent this seat in the fall. But, we're looking at other places like NY22, Brendan Williams, sort of an anti-choice Republican who I think is extremely vulnerable. But we're looking at turnout. We're looking at how fired up people are. And I think it might give us some preview of those numbers.
Well, on the turnout question, knowing that, to your point, this is a safe Democratic district. A Democrat is going to represent no matter what. If we were to see a robust turnout, turning out for George Latimer, not to vote for Jamal Bowman, does that suggest that the progressive pushback against the Biden administration's Israel policy is present? And is that a tell for what we have to look ahead to in the general?
I definitely think so. Kayleigh, it really does feel like this is going to be the kind of thing, this specific race, it's all about Israel. It's all about what's happening in the Middle East. The White House has got to be watching this very closely to see what's happening, because this very well could replicate itself over and over again between now and November. So if for no other reason, it's something that they should pay very close attention to, because that is the issue that's on the ballot here.
It's interesting when we consider this race, and we were talking to Charlie Cook about this, the Bob Good primary across the river in Virginia, where the mainstream candidate is taking the pole position here over what we might describe as the more extreme candidate. Is that going to be the narrative coming out of this primary night? The center wins?
I'm glad you mentioned that race, because we have seen kind of a wholesale rejection and a lot of fear, I should say, on the Republican side in these competitive House races about having Trump on the top of the ticket. You've seen stories in Politico today where people are starting to get really worried about it. So I think voters are sick of a lot of the Trump show and a lot of the chaos, and they're going to come on.
Trump's candidate looks like he beat Bob Good, though, in Virginia, where Trump looks kind of establishment in this case.
Well, I wouldn't go that far.
You're not going there.
Yeah, no. I think this is a real issue for MAGA folks.
Well, it's worth pointing out that McGuire, who, of course, is leading Bob Good at this point, still not an official call on that race, was at the Capitol on January 6th. But he was endorsed by, to your point, the Main Street Republicans, kind of the more Main Street groups. It's an interesting one to watch and interesting to consider the Trump endorsement in not just that case, but we look at the Utah primaries today, who he's endorsing in the congressional races in the Senate Republican primary. It is different in nature than what we've seen from Donald Trump in past cycles, Lisa. Is it just because he wants a good batting average on these endorsements, so he's not taking risks on rather unknown candidates or too far-right candidates?
It's just what Larry Sabato said earlier today to you guys is that he wants a win. He has surrounded himself by people that are strong political tacticians that know how to win races and know how to put points on the board. And so to me, that's the perspective that that's what I see, is that Trump likes to win, and that's what he wants to see happen here, especially in the race in Virginia too. You know that the former speaker himself is also playing a game in that race as well, with some money of his own. So that's another sort of factor to watch in terms of what's going on inside the party itself.
Looks like Lauren Boebert will find a way to see a new day in her political career, moving districts, that being vacated by Ken Buck. What does it mean for the Republican conference to keep the gentlewoman from Colorado in the mix?
Well, at this point, Joe, unfortunately, I don't think we can be principled as a party if we want to win back the majority. So I think that as much as she has caused a ton of concern and nail-biting by those of us who are pragmatic Republicans, I also think, too, that if you're at the NRCC, you're also saying that a win is a win and we need to get one.
It'll be different in nature than the person who represented in that seat in the past, in that Ken Buck, by the end of his tenure in Congress, was very much breaking with large parts of his party, which will be interesting. Of course, it's worth noting he no longer graces the halls of Congress, but they are back today. In fact, the Rules Committee was marking up 3 appropriations bills that the Biden White House has already promised to veto, Pat. So can I just ask what the point is? Like, yeah, you're trying to get your work done early, but if you know the work's not going to go anywhere and get final sign-off, why do it?
I mean, they want to cause chaos. You've seen the Republican majority in a lot of ways wanting to use the legislative process as a way to message or, get on Fox News or, cause some, you saw with the immigration bill where they took that down at Trump's behest to give Trump a political issue. So it's not about governing. It's not about delivering things. It's not about getting the bill signed. It's about messaging. And people are pretty sick of that kind of thing.
So start your shutdown clocks?
Alright.
September?
Nobody loves to shut down more than Donald Trump.
Excellent.
It's interesting to consider, though, Joe, if it is about messaging. The defunding Jack Smith, the special counsel initiatives, didn't make it into these appropriation bills.
That's correct. And we're waiting for an immunity ruling that will tell if his trial is about to begin. So,
oh, yeah. We still
tuned.
have 3 opinion days from the Supreme Court coming up this week. So buckle up, because it's that, in addition to the presidential debate that President Biden is preparing for in seclusion at Camp David, honing his strategy for Thursday's big night, a pivotal moment that could shape his campaign against Donald Trump. We'll be back with our political panel for more next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio.
I believe that if Joe Biden or Donald Trump say something that's palpably false, it's up to the other candidate to correct them. That is part of the information that is imparted by a debate.
That was John Keller, host of Keller at Large, talking with Joe earlier today on Bloomberg Radio to discuss the crucial responsibility of fact-checking during a live presidential debate, which, of course, we're gearing up for on Thursday. Back with us now, our political panel, Lisa Camooso Miller, former RNC Communications Director and host of the Friday Reporter podcast, and Pat Dennis, president at American Bridge 21st Century. So obviously, we just heard from Mr. Keller there the idea that the candidate should fact-check the other. But Hillary Clinton, who points out in a New York Times essay today that she is the only person who has debated both of these men, essentially argued it's a waste of time to try to refute an argument from Donald Trump. The quote from her, "It's nearly impossible to identify what his arguments even are. He starts with nonsense and then digresses into blather." How do you debate against that, Lisa?
Well, it's a challenge. There's no question about it. We've seen them both do it before. And the thing about this is that I think the way that the president is approaching the preparation and the way that the former president is approaching preparation is very, very different. They're both two very, very different debaters. Joe Biden has to come off as likable. He has to come off as competent. He has to come off as someone who is still capable of running all the things in the country. Donald Trump just needs to do no harm. And unfortunately, as we've watched over the course of the last many, many years now, it feels like dog years, but it seems to me that it doesn't really matter what he says because his supporters are still going to support him regardless of that. So he has to be more measured. He has to be less insulting, but it'll be difficult for him because that is really his style.
Well, so interesting here on the fact check. I'm curious to hear from both of you on this. Should this, because the media is having a moment, the news media is having a moment here, should this be up to the moderators to live fact check, which blew up in the face, by the way, I'll remind everyone, of CNN, the same network doing this debate at its town hall with Donald Trump. It resulted in a change in management. Or is it up to the other candidate?
So my organization, American Bridge 21st Century, will be live fact-checking on TrumpResearchBook.com. So leave it to us. Ultimately, Trump is lucky if he can finish a sentence. He tends to get distracted midway through and then wander off. Trying to track that down will make the debate untenable. I think he could run into a real situation where his entire campaign premise blows up tonight, though, because he's running on the sole idea that Joe Biden is senile and can't do the job as president. And what happens if you lose a debate to that guy? Like, what is your campaign about at that point?
So essentially, he has lowered the bar for Biden too much, is what you're arguing.
I mean, he's tried to, and now he's kind of panicked and tried to walk that back. But, you know, they've debated before, and the first debate in 2020 was a disaster for Trump. It was a real problem.
The shut up man debate?
Yeah, keep yapping is what
we'll see that cut a few more times in the next couple of days. If I'm reading you right, though, Lisa, this is about style. You said it doesn't matter what Donald Trump says. Does it matter what Joe Biden says, or is it about standing up, showing posture, energy, being in full voice?
I really do think that this is a likability. This is a popularity contest. We're going back to the original tenets of politics, right? Wow. Yeah. Because so much of what this is now is Donald Trump will win over his supporters because they want to support him, and same will be for Joe Biden. It's going to be that very, very slim margin, almost as slim as what's happening in Virginia's primary right now, that we will have to, those are the people that will have to decide whether or not one is more capable than the other. And so it's a likability contest. It's a do no harm contest. Yeah. And honestly, it's like the car crash that's been scheduled for Thursday, and everyone will be watching.
Wow. 373 votes. That is pretty close. All right, thanks to Lisa Camooso Miller and Pat Dennis. We're going to avoid a crash right now by simply pointing you to the Washington Edition newsletter. You can find it on the terminal and online. And we should remind everyone, Kaylee, special coverage for the debate, 8 p.m. right here, Washington time, Thursday night.
Yep, straight through until 11 p.m. But we still have 2 days to go. So come back and join us on Balance of Power at the regular time tomorrow at 5 p.m. We'll see you then on Bloomberg TV and radio.